Hi history friends. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the fall of the Soviet Union. On Christmas Day of 1991, the Soviet flag flew for the last time over the Kremlin. And countries like the Ukraine and Georgia and Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, there were others, became the Commonwealth of Independent States. The reason for this is manifold, and let's talk a little bit about it. First off, the reason that the Soviet Union fell was that communism itself is inefficient. There's no real reward for hard work or creativity. As a matter of fact, it was hard to be creative. Think of the, Mikoyan and Gurevich, aircraft designers. They got into trouble when they designed aircraft that were too good, things like that. So, another issue is that Soviet goods were inferior. They could sell them as long as they had a closed European market that couldn't buy from the outside world. But once that opened up, you're not going to buy a Soviet-built anything if it doesn't have the letters AK in front of it. So the next thing is the Soviet Union was super repressive towards its Eastern European allies. I mean, the other Warsaw Pact countries were basically treated like colonies and their resources were taken and things like that. So the Soviet Union did not leave a lot of friends behind. Also, there was just massive military spending and they just couldn't keep up with it with their economy. Also, because they only had one party, the Communist Party, there was no real push for any type of reform. Then you have the failure in Afghanistan. All right, let's talk a little bit about fast forwarding up into the 1980s. In 1985, I believe it was March, a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the head of the Soviet Union. And he's the head of the Communist Party, but he was actually a reformer. And one of the things that he wanted was something called Glassnose, and that means openness. Basically, it means let's stop being repressive, let's be a little bit more open to new ideas, so people could start to study Western ideas in schools. People were freed from gulags, that's real freedom. There was a freer press. And for the first time, there were multiple parties available in real live elections. Next, there was something called perestroika, and what that was economic restructuring. Basically, the government was going to kind of back away from controlling the entire Soviet economy. Unfortunately, what is going to happen is it's going to make it so that strikes are okay, which is great for the people, not so good for the government. There's going to be more foreign investment. And there's going to be an emphasis on the creation of private businesses. The upshot of it is that it just didn't work. They didn't have the experience, and you know who did have experience? Organized crime. And organized crime syndicates basically kind of took over the economy, unfortunately. So here's the deal. It went too fast. If you've lived under a guaranteed salary and all of a sudden it's gone, things are going to be problematic. Also, private businesses just couldn't keep up with demand. They were new. They were just trying to start up. And so what you started to see was massive lines for basic necessities and then rationing. And I remember seeing this when I was growing up and when I was in high school, and I'm like, wow, that is a failed system, because you'd see these massive lines and then the shelves were empty. Interesting stuff. Here is a very important point in time, because Ronald Reagan was our president, and Ronald Reagan was an important figure politically because he was so staunchly anti-communist. And what he's going to do is he's going to come in, he's going to talk about the Soviet Union leading an evil empire. he's going to dump money into something called Star Wars, which was this fanciful idea that we could, which is really cool by the way, that we could create killer satellites that could knock out Soviet ICBMs. It wasn't up and running. It appears as if the president thought it was because it scuttled the Reykjavik treaty. It was an arms treaty. Reagan came in with this just hard-handedness, and Gorbachev was at the same time trying to be kind of chill. It ended up working because they created a form of relationship. They seemed like they were friendly towards one another. They could actually talk to each other. But Reagan wanted to come in from a position of strength, so we redoubled our effort, spending massively on the military. Who cares about the national debt? We're going to have a gajillion nukes. And part of the reason we did that was this, we knew that the Soviets could not match it. Gorbachev at the same time said he wanted to end the arms race. He wanted to pull out of Afghanistan. He wanted to get the Red Army completely out of Europe. And he was going to practice something called non-interventionism. What that's going to lead to when former communist nations looked around and said, there's no Soviet tanks here. We can do what we want. Poland is going to have something called the Solidarity Movement, which was, it started with a bunch of dockyard workers, but they created a union, and they demanded through strikes free elections. And Poland got free elections in 1989. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Sure, it may have had to do with David Hasselhoff, but the issue is this was a huge symbol of the failure of communism, and it happened the year that I graduated from high school. Czechoslovakia voted to basically separate itself, and they did it democratically and nicely. Now, Romania wasn't so good. I remember it was right around Christmas time. Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife were put up against a wall and shot, and we got to see that on CNN. That was exciting. But here's the deal. By August of 1991, the Communist Party arrested Gorbachev and put him in house arrest. They said it was for his protection. They said it was for health reasons. But there was a coup. The military moved in on Moscow, and they were met by Soviet people linking arms and creating human change to stop these tanks. The president of Russia, a gentleman named Boris Yeltsin, somehow stumbled on top of a tank, and he led the resistance to this coup. The coup was a bunch of communist hardliners. They wanted to get back to the days of Stalin. And what's going to happen is Yeltsin is going to win. In 3 days, the coup is over. They fired on their own Capitol building, and it was pretty amazing. What's going to happen is very quickly, then again on Christmas Day, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Asked later about this, Mikhail Gorbachev stated that the Cold War not only crippled our economy, but it also crippled our public attitudes and our morals. And that was why the Soviet Union failed. Today, fast forward, the reason that Vladimir Putin has become so popular is that he has basically made it his policy to make Russia great again like they had once been. Now, Vladimir Putin is running into some real problems with the coronavirus, and boy does he like to kill opposition leaders, members of other political parties, and civilians in any old aircraft that happens to be in the sky. But he took this idea that the Soviet Union was great, let's get back to when we were great, and he's trying to push that again to this day. Probably a good idea to not go back to a Soviet style of communism. Thank you guys very much. I hope you're staying healthy. I hope you're staying safe. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks a lot, guys.